Hello, my name is Nick Wilson, and I'll be facilitating our webinar today focused on innovating with human-centered design to drive real impact. Thank you all for joining and welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded, and the download link to the recording will be shared with you afterward. Second, we will have live Q&A at the end as part of our panel with our presenters. To ask a question, please use the chat box feature on your GoToWebinar control panel, usually found at the right of your screen. For any questions we can't get to in our live session, we'll be sure to follow up with you afterwards. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters today. Joining us are an amazing group of folks that bring unique real-world experience to implementing HCD. Chris Casturo is Managing Director at Point Management Group. He has more than 20 years of experience in strategy, program management, supply chain management. He's helped clients all the way up to the Fortune 10 operationalize strategy to drive improved business performance. Norma Nieto is Director of the Program and Transformation Office at CEI and is a transformation veteran. She has over 20 years of consulting experience spanning strategy and innovation. Here at CEI, she is entrusted with driving enterprise transformation to improve key KPIs and to build a foundation for long-term success. Prior to CEI, she was at IBM, where she consulted on highly visible innovation projects. Finally, we have Justin McCaldy. He's the Senior Director of User Experience and Design here at CEI. He is certified by Luma and the Nielsen Norman Group. He's an award-winning thought leader with nearly 20 years of experience and is adept at institutionalizing human-centered design and design thinking processes to really yield results. Justin will be kicking off the webinar today and guiding discussion leading up to the panel. So with that, Justin, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Nick. At a quick level agenda here, we're going to cover a few things: background and key principles of human-centered design, the application of human-centered design to strategy, innovation, and product design. We're going to roll right into a panel discussion and then an additional Q&A thereafter. So without further ado, I'd like to jump right in. What is human-centered design? There's a lot of words out there that are being thrown around, a few of them being design thinking and service design. Design thinking is essentially the design process, a recipe, if you will, that you can follow or adapt to define and solve problems. Those problems can frankly be anything. But in terms of service design, it often uses design thinking to solve those problems, actually problems being beyond the product and digital experiences. If you will, service design is more of a holistic level, an end-to-end design process. For example, companies such as Uber and Lyft, prior to their arrival, probably leveraged service design to get that innovation to provide a new service. So what is kind of bad design? The Norman door is a good example of that. A Norman door is a term that's used to identify with a door that frankly cannot be used without failure. You might have saw an example of this particular door out in the wild. We actually have them at the CEI office. Though aesthetically beautiful, functionally they fail regularly. You might actually see these Norman doors along with little tag that says either push or pull. The reason why is because they're not incredibly intuitive upon arrival. And I'll get into that the next slide. Essentially, why these are called the Norman door is Don Norman, who coined the term user experience originally, started to identify human-centered design or user experience design by explaining what a Norman door or what these doors are and why they fail so bad. So the Norman door is essentially the basics of usability and human-centered design at its core. The Norman door is essentially when the affordance that is associated with an object does not actually match its actual function. Like for example, a staircase affords ascending or descending efforts or function. As these doors, these examples here, these are really good examples of good design for doors. You have a knob that you turn, or a bar that you pull, or a push plate that you push. These are intuitive to us because we over time start to functionality since birth. And by doing that, it makes it very easy for us to understand. In human-centered design, or in good design, we understand those things and we pay homage to them. In bad design, we don't. And an example of that would be the Norman door. So how do we approach problems? Human-centered design is, this is a good example of it. IDEO actually produced this graphic. We start at the desirability factor, essentially the human factor. You might have even heard that called before, human factors. It's the desirability. Is it something that we need, we want, we can leverage as a human race, as a collection of people? Then we start to apply different things to it. Is it viable? Does this give us, some profit? Does this actually help our business with revenue? Is this even something that our market would even be interested in? Also, is it feasible from a technology perspective? Does it fit our prior stack? Is it something that we've invested a whole bunch of money into and could align to it? The intersection of all three of those is innovation, which is the core in the center here. And so one thing that I do want to call out, there are situations and circumstances that human-centered designers actually love constraints, right? It actually provides us focus, guidance. And by guidance is actually sometimes starting at that business level, that viability level. So in human-centered design, yes, we definitely start at the desirability factor, but with direction from the business. And Norma is going to delve into that.
Thanks, Justin. So really, we're talking about now more of the business aspects here. So regardless of whether you might start with the human or you might start with the business, you really have to consider the reasons why you're even doing this in the first place. Why are you trying to be innovative? Why are you applying human-centered design? Obviously, there's a problem you're trying to solve, and we all have shareholders and stakeholders that we're answerable to. We're not in the business of doing innovation just for innovation's sake. So when we think of the business strategy drivers, typically one or more of these drivers are going to be in play and could be driving an organization's need to look at things in a different way. So along the top of the ring, we have our external drivers of innovation. So, very traditional growth. Again, you're trying to grow your market share. You might be facing some increased competition. Maybe other companies are doing things very innovatively. They're coming up with new stuff and you're lagging behind. Closely linked to these are, a product or service portfolio. Maybe you've been putting out the same things or the same products and you need a way to develop some innovation. You might be facing some low customer satisfaction and engagement. So those are some of the external drivers that might create a need for human-centered design. But it's not just the external. You can also really leverage human-centered design for addressing some internal drivers, such as cost. Maybe you have really high costs. Either it could be linked to the way you serve customers, or it could be linked to internal inefficiencies, such as the way that people are performing their jobs. It can also be a lack of adoption of processes or of technology. It's very common for companies to invest a great deal of money in a new technology or what they think is an innovation, and then it never delivers the value that was expected, perhaps because the people that should be using it aren't using it or aren't using it in the right ways. So those are some of the things that can drive that. Chris, as our business strategy expert, do you have anything to add to that?
Thanks, Norma. Yeah, as you think about the way business strategy and a business strategy methodology integrates with the human-centered design components, it's really about customer-driven visioning and really customer needs analysis relative to your competitors in terms of differentiation in the marketplace to drive business results. And if you do that in a human-centered way, rather than just a focus on profit or profitability, that's where you get to human-centered design. Now, we'll get into more of that as we talk about the tools that we use in order to accomplish these results and how it fits into an overall innovation methodology as we get to the later slides. But that gives you a flavor of how it fits to a strategy methodology.
Great, thanks, Chris. So here we have, really, we talk about real impact in the title of this. So again, we're not doing innovation for innovation's sake. We're not doing human-centered design just because it's the latest flavor of the month. We're doing it because it delivers real results. And a study by McKinsey found that actual companies that invest in design thinking in human-centered design have outperformed the S&P by 228% in the last year. So they've actually delivered higher returns to their shareholders. They've had 10% higher revenue growth compared to the average industry of 3 to 6%. And we know why, because their customers adopt their products, they like them better. There's a lot of different reasons, which we'll expand upon a little later. But the bottom line is it delivers results.
Thanks, Norma. What is it in action, right? So strategy-driven, human-centered design in action. These are real things. These are real results, right? 8% in Zillow was the boosted conversion rate just by providing geographic context to home listings. It's a very small thing, but via the human-centered design process, actually engaging with the customer, hearing them, really hearing them, rather than designing from a C-level suite, allowed for 8% boosted conversion. For example, in StubHub, by simply adding a button, it's 2.6% lift in purchase rate just by that application. So it could be very small things. It's very purposeful things, big change, big increases. Another example, 45% increased yield for Bank of America by implementing a 5-step online banking enrollment process in human-centered design. We, as humans, start to get annoyed, maybe via the annoyance, we navigate away from certain things. We get annoyed because we don't understand something. Containerizing something, bucketing something in 5 steps allowed customers to actually digest information, understand it, don't get frustrated with it, and you can see it yields massive results. So how do we use design to solve business problems? Via design thinking, designers and other C-suite members are essentially rubbing shoulders with C-suite members, helping to influence business strategy decisions and shape innovative ideas. Traditionally, designers were involved much later in the development process, creating an idea or after an idea has been thought about. But design thinking has actually helped them move them upstream. And here's 3 different examples above that, the box text, that has been done by 3 different thought leadership in the human-centered design space. Stanford D School. Stanford has a school that's called D School that actually started framing the design thinking process, the human-centered design process, applying a framework to it, where they've quantified it as empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test into these kind of channels of thought. IDEO, they started the divergence and convergence kind of thought process where we start at inspiration, then we lead into ideation, and then there's an implementation. And IBM also took their spin on it, which is a little bit more of an agile process, which is continual, observe, reflect, and make. But really, in essence, they all have a very similar pattern, as you can see. It's a double diamond. And so some folks on the call here today might have heard double diamond, and some might not have. But as you can see, they all kind of have a similar type of pattern to it. And so the double diamond is actually becoming a very well-known model here. It's developed by the British Design Council in 2005, following a long study that involved corporate giants such as Microsoft, Starbucks, Sony, and Lego. So these folks have started realizing that there's a certain pattern and there's maybe a better way of doing it. And we at CEI really, really feel strongly about the double diamond. It kind of takes everything and puts them together. Really what it is the divergent and convergent thought process of really breaking down a problem. right? And so if you were to start, say for example, on the left-hand side where it says A, I don't know, it could be this, I'm not quite sure, right? And then we lead it all the way through to the other side, which is B, where you do know it should be this. We'll walk through that process real quick. So we first quantified as the first diamond, which is essentially designing the right thing. What is the right thing? How do we know it's the right thing, right? And then the second diamond is designing it right. So within designing the right thing, the left-hand diamond, we break it into sub-sides, right? Two different sides of that diamond, which is that divergent and convergent thought process. The discovery, which is we're essentially opening it up. We accept scope creep. We want a blue sky. We want to exhaust all options. We want to consume, which is the divergent process. And the convergent process is basically patterizing, synthesizing, quantifying what those observations were or what these things are to really make it a real thing, to funnel it down. And so in the divergent thought process, we always start with a kickoff. We want to understand the business goals, wants, needs, objectives at a high level. Really, that is, again, what we had mentioned before, starts to apply the constraint initially. We need some sort of focus or some sort of driver or constraint in this process. So we want to gauge expectations early on with the client, right? And so during that kickoff process, we chart all those waters. But then we continue that divergent process where we want to try to open it up, right? So we identify, you know, is it an internal customer? Is it an external customer? Is it both? And then we want to research it. We want to get context. We need to start the empathy process. And so we do a lot of research techniques. We're going to get into them a little bit later, but we're just starting to scratch the surface here in design thinking. But design thinking is heavily applied at this current moment. This is the core research process. So we gather initial primary research. And then during that research, we're going to start to identify certain patterns. Those patterns, we're going to start clustering together. We're going to start seeing things, right? And sometimes the business, even though that maybe one might be rated, we saw it 10 times, and one might be, for example, we saw it 5 times, the business says 5 is more important to us. However, as human-centered designers, we see level of importance based upon how many instances and how large those instances are. So we essentially run it through our own personal algorithm applied with the business in mind. After we cluster those topics, after we got that insight, we want to apply additional context to them. So typically where we identify the problems first or identify certain things first, and then we locate one of the, or a few of the biggest, right? And so we want to apply a secondary round of research to those, getting additional context and getting further clarification within that space. After we do that, we've started to gather our research findings. They're a little unstructured, they're purposeful, but a little unstructured. So we need to start the structuring process. So we start gathering insights, which we've already within the second research phase, we've already started, but we want to formalize those. We want to crystallize those insights. And by crystallizing those insights, we start formulating themes. Themes then roll into opportunity areas, which then the business is involved in seeing some of this during this convergent process, so they can apply their influence and they can help guide us down that path. That opportunity area, which before we get to ideation, we have some core direction in that ideation or the forthcoming designing things right perspective. But one thing that we highly suggest is the HMW, which is the how might we. So we take those opportunities, those areas of opportunity, and we say, okay, we frame the problem space or we frame the opportunity space. Then we apply, well, how might we do blank, right? Based upon those opportunities. That then sets us up for the ideation process to occur. The ideation process is, again, another divergent process, right? So our key objective now is to open it back up, but under the constraint of the context and the information that we've just absorbed. We create ideas, right? Then we evaluate those ideas, just as we did with the research. You can see this pattern. We evaluate those ideas. Some are good, some are bad. Actually, no ideas are really a bad idea, because sometimes bad ideas formulate even better ideas, or the idea that's actually chosen. So we go through that kind of funneling process, and leads into new ideas. And then those new ideas we prioritize, or we visualize the vote. There's a lot of different methods on how to do that. And then we build, we test, and we iterate based upon those ideas. Sometimes we build, test, and iterate the best idea and it fails miserably. So we reach back into those bucket of ideas and maybe try something else, or maybe a combination of the two. And if you really look at it, we go through a few different rounds of testing because frankly, it's just an assumption until we properly test it. We want to make sure it fails on paper. We want to make sure it fails before it gets into a code or into production, where we might get those conversion rates drop so much that we can't pull ourselves back out of that hole. So then we start getting into that MVP. We understand what our minimum viable product is. We understand what is the most important things to build and how to build them, and frankly, maybe even what they look like at that point to some degree. And so this is the double diamond process. This is, as you can see, as we went through the D School, IDEO, and IBM's process, this is a very similar process, but it's really broken down into very insightful areas, very purposeful areas to gain and understand what the impact is and gain immediate insight. So Norma is going to talk a little bit about the traditional side and the kind of new school HCD side to the ideation and the evaluation states.
Thanks, Justin. So even one of the things that I did was work with very large traditional organizations that were looking for ways to innovate. And, as you learn more about HCD, you start to realize that the standard criteria, the standard way that you do things aren't necessarily always taking into account that customer-centric or human-centric view. So it's not to say that, a traditional organization that you don't need to look at the traditional ways of doing things, but you can just enhance it by adding some of the HCD elements. So let's start with ideation. Everyone who's been through innovation knows that you go through an ideation process where you're sitting around a room brainstorming ideas. So traditionally, these might consist of executive steering committees. They include stakeholders from various groups of management. They might include external consultants that you've hired to help you come up with ideas. With the human-centered design approach, you might start expanding that. Where do you get your ideas from? You might talk to user groups. You might do some crowdsourcing internally with your employees who are on the front lines with customers. You might use customer journey maps, which will illustrate a little bit more. But to me, customer journey maps is a really key element of understanding how to really apply human-centered design and shift some of those paradigms. So once you do ideation, now you want to make sure that you're also using the right evaluation criteria for ideas, right? How do we converge on the right ideas? So traditionally, ROI, a lot of times that's it. You're looking at ROI, you're looking at revenue, you're looking at feasibility. But you want to make sure if you're going to do human-centered design that you want to take into account the things that you're actually trying to solve for, which include improved usability, user adoption, productivity, engagement, and satisfaction. So it's really just to enhance and add to our traditional frameworks to apply to make sure that we're including that human-centered design element as we're moving forward. So here, I'll turn this, again, the customer journey map was so critical for me as I was really learning how to apply customer-centric or human-centered design to innovation. So I'll let Justin, he'll do it a lot better justice than I will.
Thanks, Norma. So yes, the journey map, it doesn't necessarily always need to be a customer. That is external facing. Internal facing is user, right? Quantifying it high level, journey map. Experience map is Luma, which is a design thinking certification practitioner process. They call it experience maps. So a lot of people call it different things, but essentially what it is understanding and empathizing with this persona or user or human, right? And so it's a combination of things, right? It's following that person around, getting context rather than hearing it out of their mouth. It's actually observing it as well, and then documenting those. And so really what it is the journey map is actually done in the research phase, right? The first diamond, the first half of that diamond helps us, if you will, capture the information during our research. We understand, well, we need to first understand who Chris is. What is his, goals, what is his job role, or what is his demographic, what makes Chris Chris, right? And so after we understand who Chris is, we want to essentially stalk Chris to some degree, end to end. It depends. Are we basically watching him just use an application? Sure. Is it? Are we watching Chris? You know, as soon as he hits this, you know, the snooze button and gets up out of bed, hey, maybe, right? And the difference there is if he's hit the snooze button, that's end to end, and before he crawls into bed at night, right? So the day in the life of Chris and all of his pain points and moments of opportunity tends to be at that level more of a service design thing, right? It's how do we position ourselves to come with a new product to market that is going to help Chris's life, right? And essentially create business, right? And success by human need. And that visibility can be done via the journey map. Now, we can also apply a journey map to a particular scenario or a particular engagement with a particular device or an app or a site or a piece of software, which is an example of this right here. We actually break it down to pre-engagement, device engagement, and then post-device engagement. So, you know, Chris is doing this, Chris is doing that, right? He's going through this path. And so from pre-engagement, we typically go like maybe, you know, why the drivers that he's starting to engage with this application, right? And that sometimes bubbles up to a larger engagement, which is more service design oriented. But this is just helping us maybe as we're doing contextual inquiry, which is contextual inquiry is essentially just walking around with Chris or someone like Chris and identifying, you know, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? And then we capture all that information in the journey map. So one of the muscle memory factors here, right? As we observe something, we capture that and we capture it with the context around it. So maybe fast forward about a month or two down the road, as it's captured, and maybe we were in person and we saw it, but this is a fantastic way to capture it because now it's almost muscle memory, right? We're applying an image and context around it so we can really delve back into the empathy that we were feeling for Chris as we were doing our observations with him. So this is a massive, massive method, a very staple method in terms of identifying pain point, recalling those pain points or moments of opportunity, and possibly other areas that we can service that particular persona or role. So I'm going to hand it back to Norma, and Norma's going to speak a little bit about, Norma and Chris, about the business strategy piece of innovation.
Right, so taking a massive zoom back is really thinking about before you embark on any kind of innovation, transformation, whether it's human-centered design or otherwise, is to really ask your organization, how will human-centered design innovation fit into our business strategy? Is it really a one-time lever for a tactical product development? You know, you're just going to go in, we need to improve this app, let's use human-centered design and fix it or develop a new one? Or are you really trying to embark upon enterprise-wide human-centered design transformation? So to answer that question, you really do need to start with your business strategy. So I'm going to turn it, ask Chris to expand a little bit upon some methods for how you'd go about answering that question.
So when we look at integrating a business strategy with human-centered design, and we think about the way that a company does its customer-driven visioning, we use the term customer-driven visioning, and then we apply it against competitive positioning, against the ecosystem of products and services within your marketplace that you can deliver value. And that value is driven by a growth strategy, a cost reduction strategy, or the infrastructure required in order to support those things. And when you do that and you apply the tools that Justin has described up to this point, and you use that for ideation or journey mapping or competitive positioning, you get a view of business strategy that can map initiatives by business value and business fit. And what Norma will talk to next is how does that fit into an overall innovation program, because you'll hear folks say we do innovative strategy and we have an innovation model in order to drive business strategy in a model like the one on the slide that you see here.
Right. So once you've figured out the answer, and if you really want to drive and create long-lasting culture of innovation, like organizations like Apple, like Uber, like 3M, for example, which is a more traditional innovation company, you need to think about really, again, what's the scope of what you're trying to accomplish? Where's your focus? Are you your innovation mix? So are you focused on just product innovation or service innovation? Are you looking at processes, both external and internal? Perhaps you're looking to transform and innovate your whole business model, the whole way that you do business. And then really think about what is it that you're trying to get out of it? What value is innovation going to deliver to your organization? Why are you investing in this? And then once you define the mandate for innovation, you need to think about the management and governance. Where does innovation sit within your organization? Does it permeate throughout? Sometimes, people do innovation on the side, like they have other regular jobs and they're on a task force, or you need to really think about the organizational aspects of it. When I worked with very traditional organizations that were perhaps more, siloed, they would create incubators to foster innovation and to kind of get outside their traditional decision-making process. So, how are those decisions made? If you have a very traditional capital investment program that requires a great deal of, financial analysis and things like that, do you pull innovation out to accommodate those kinds of things? So these are things that you really need to think about to create a long-lasting culture of innovation. And, when you think internally, how does your culture deal with innovation? How does it deal with failure? Are you allowed to fail with ideas or not? So you need to think about those long-term things if you truly want to move towards becoming an innovation-driven organization. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Nick to lead us into the Q&A/panel.
Hey, thanks, Norma. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Justin. As Norma just alluded to, we're going to move into the facilitated panel discussion of the webinar, which does incorporate your questions. So as a reminder, you can ask a question via the chat feature of your GoToWebinar control panel, again, usually on the right-hand side of your screen. To get started, Justin, let's lead off with a question for you. You've been involved in HCD for about 15 years. During that time, how have you seen HCD evolve in its use and deployment?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I appreciate the question. So it's been around for a while. Participatory design is, I think, what we're talking about here. So it's pretty traditional itself. It's problem solving. It's just applying context to it. Dates pretty far back, even possibly Plato. So human-centered design is not new, right? However, as I mentioned earlier, the frameworks around them are new. It's making things a little bit more digestible for folks. And when people feel like they understand something, they're more apt to actually practice it or use it. And these are tested, these are tried, and they're succeeding. As you can see on the one slide, design-centric companies are outperforming non-design-centric companies extensively. It's a real thing. And I think that that's why you're seeing a lot of folks adopting human-centered design as a real thing because of that success. And I think the success is in human-centered design is being created because those frameworks are there to support it.
Justin, thank you. Hey, Chris, I'm going to come over to you. You've been involved in strategy for 25 years of your career. What do you see is missed when HCD is not incorporated in the strategy discussion?
Thanks for the question, Nick. Yeah, when you think about strategy over the last 25 years and a pure strategy methodology focused on profit, focused on product, focused on competitive positioning without what would be true customer-driven visioning from the front end back, what I think is missed is what the user's true needs are, whether that's an external customer, as Norma described, or whether that's an internal stakeholder driving cost reduction. when you use the human-centered design techniques, you truly get to what's driving the customer behavior. And when you get what's driving the customer behavior, you drive profit to the bottom line. And part of what's there is, what Justin had talked about earlier in terms of small things can make big differences when customer-driven visioning is applied through these tools and techniques. It gets to the true essence of what's driving the human behavior that's driving growth strategy and driving cost reduction strategy. And by incorporating human-centered design from software design into business strategy, you drive differentiated value to the end customer.
Chris, thank you very much. So Norma, I'm going to come over to you now. You are our resident expert in innovation and change management. How do you see HCD affecting the way companies view innovation and change?
So I think the change management aspects of this are really important. Back in the 90s, there was a whole culture, practice, processes around change management, and they went along side by side with transformation or process redesign or technology design. And I really think what human-centered design has done is kind of merge those two disciplines in a way that really integrates it from the very beginning, so that you're not left after, doing cultural change readiness assessments after the fact. You've hopefully built all that stuff in to begin with, so that the impacts and the pain of change has been minimized because you've designed these processes, or you've done a system implementation, or you've worked with people to really address their needs and their pain points, so that change feels like a positive welcome thing rather than something that's foisted upon them after the fact and that they didn't necessarily have buy-in. And it's one of those things that a lot of times gets pushed to the side until it's almost too late. So I really think it can make a big difference in terms of addressing the pain of change that all humans feel, most humans feel. People don't like change that much.
Norma, thank you. So I do have a few other questions for the panel. I want to jump to them so that we don't miss out. So one from the audience. So one question is, what methods of HCD do you all see as being most valuable?
Yeah, I can jump on that real quick. So human-centered design, AKA design thinking, there are a gamut of methods out there. Every method has its reason. Every method has its expected outcome or driving certain outcomes. I would say that the top three is, as I covered earlier, the customer or user or experience map, journey map is great for helping facilitate the areas of pain point, if you will, maybe even allowing for facilitating the discussion of priority along with the design team and the business team, and then driving the spitting order of essentially how we should tackle these things. Contextual inquiry is also along with that, right? So we need the context. Essentially, those two factors alone, we can derive a lot of empathy from. So the core objective in human-centered design is empathy. If we don't achieve empathy, we don't really empathize with the particular scenario that person's in or that business is in, and really feel those problems, it's really hard to solve them. It actually just makes it a little bit more difficult. We could probably still solve them, but it makes it a lot easier if we have the context. And then furthermore, I think talk aloud testing, right? So the evaluation period of our assumptions, it's still, we don't do this for a living, right? Maybe we aren't, I'm not a manufacturer officer or something, right? And say, for example, and it's hard for me to scramble to become one, right? And to really gain that empathy. I do my best, and my team does our best job in creating that empathy. However, anything that allows us to test those, tried assumptions or maybe, half assumptions, and get people to speak about why does it work and why it doesn't work, which is think aloud testing, is also one of my biggest methods as well. So again, applying additional level context to it. Well, if it's very tactile, if it's a product, someone's explaining why it is failing or it doesn't work as well while they're actually failing, gives me twofold context. So those three are huge for me personally.
Justin, thank you. Another question that has come in. You've touched on some already, but can you give some real examples of how you've seen HCD applied to your customers and the impact that they saw?
You want me to take this one? I can take it too.
I can.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Norma.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I've worked with several large organizations that have some very traditional ways of doing things. One of them was the Department of Education, and they were really looking at how to transform their standardized testing. And one thing, as we all know, if anyone who has children here, the ways that children learn have greatly changed. You know, they are a lot more human-centered. They're a lot more tactile. They use technology, and you know, we're still doing those, you know, filling in the little circles, which is not very conducive to, you know, testing knowledge in a way that students are used to learning it. So we worked with their organization to really help them think about it, really infuse their testing and make their testing aligned to the way that their students/users were really learning. And again, you know, they created an incubation. They brought in a broad group of people to solicit ideas, and you know, they've really realigned some of their testing. Now they still have some of the business constraints as far as, you know, being able to demonstrate results from year to year and things like that, but they've really made a lot of progress in shifting the paradigm of how they're going to do testing in the future.
Yeah, I think I have one too. We had a very, very large, and still we have actually created a partnership with this particular client, but a very large retail food chain, food store, and they themselves really lead the whole entire company on providing the best customer experience, as well as their employee experience, right? And so that's a part of their brand, a huge part of their brand. However, you know, we were just first engaged, and I did a small little audit or evaluation, and they very much are that. However, they weren't practicing human-centered design. They weren't doing things in a human-centered design way in terms of like tactile product delivery. And so I started engaging and started to work on the user personas, quantifying these people, you know, who are these people, what makes them them, what are their job roles. And, you know, I saw a little bit of a disengagement at some point, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. You know, I typically have a lot of skeptics, and that's fine, and especially in a company that's never done it before. And I welcome the opportunity. I welcome the challenge. And so the executive came over to me at the end of the persona framing effort, and he asked, you know, I hear that you're going to go to the store and you're going to speak to some people. Do you mind if I tag along? And I was all for it, and I'm like, you know, that sounds like a great idea. But however, you know, I was aware that if he overengaged or asked questions and, you know, was really, you know, dressed up, and it could potentially skew my data set, right? Where the person that I was shadowing, or doing contextual inquiry with, and interviewing might feel scared to really honestly answer questions. And that would absolutely skew my data set and kind of blow up the whole entire engagement. And I said, under the premise that, you know, you just stand back and, you know, just observe, but that's about it. He agreed. And we walked through the store with multiple users that we identified a few days before. And at the end of the day, you know, we're all exhausted, right? We went through all these different personas and all these different users, and observed them and asked them questions and watched them use applications and watched them do their jobs, continually talking and asking questions and taking pages and pages and pages of notes. At the end of the day, he came up to me and he said, tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, I just want to let you know, this has been the most insightful learnings, the observations that I've ever seen before. Typically, this company does a lot of, you know, from the grassroots level. I used to be this person, I used to be that person, I know what this is. But however, times change, technology changes, people change, society changes. I mean, look at the past 10 years, the pace of life is so much faster. And so those things change. And by those changes being applied, also the changes need to be accommodated by the business to support their customers and also their internal employees. And so he just said to me how impactful and how much he's going to tell everybody about how much he learned today just by walking around with you know, the employee all day. So really great experience there.
Nick, I could probably give a quick example to build on Justin's as well. We were working with a large American retailer, and the question was really about omnichannel and what's the best way to serve the customer as it evolves from brick and mortar to online, and as that percentages increases, you know, how does that affect you know, customer demand and how does it really drive revenue to the bottom line, and how does that integrate with a internationalization strategy? So if you say, okay, I'm a retailer that has an online presence and a brick and mortar presence, can the person return the product to the store, and how does that process work, and how does the person feel when that happens? Or as I'm going to an international strategy and I launch in Europe, is it okay if the customer receives the product in 2 days versus 1 day? And what are the supply chain implications to those changes? And when you drive that from a human-centered design perspective, as it's evolving to in an evolving marketplace, and you test that back against customer needs, and you use some of the tools that Justin has described, you really see the impact drop to the bottom line. So this was, you know, a large retailer that went through that process and really saw a lot of value in using human-centered design techniques to drive the business strategy for both omnichannel and internationalization.
Those are all great examples. I do have one other big question from the audience. So the question that came in is HCD for all companies. What do you guys think?
Norma, that's a good one for you.
Yeah, I would say if you have humans at your company and you interact with humans, then yes, it can be. It should be. So, I mean, I think we can always do better by, as Justin has said, being empathetic to the experiences that our employees have, that our customers have. You know, I can't imagine a company, I mean, unless you're, you know, just having robots go around, then, you know, it definitely helps to take into account in a process way, in a service way, even in a business model way. If you're serving customers, there's people involved. So I think the answer to that is a resounding yes.
And really, it's not just customers, it's stakeholders, because whether it's the financial services industry, where we had some examples, or the retail industry, or you know, whether it's healthcare, or you know, whether it's any other type of business, we're seeing human-centered design applied against strategy. How do I look relative to my competitor in terms of servicing customer need? And in an internal scenario, if I'm running a sourcing function, how do I better provide the data to the chief procurement officer to do market analysis and to be able to make better decisions in that capacity? If it's easier for the customer, if it's easier for the employee, if it's differentiated from the competitor, all of the things that human-centered design really drives is appropriate. So yeah, I agree. It goes across all businesses and all industries.
Guys, thank you very much. So at this point, we need to wrap up the panel discussion to be able to wrap up our webinar. For those questions that we didn't get to, we'll make sure that we reach out to you afterwards personally, so stay tuned. We are nearing the end. What I'd like to do is, Justin, turn it back over to you for some thoughts on how folks can get started, and then for any final thoughts you might have.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So, really, how do you get started? Here at CEI, we really, we can jump in it at any point, frankly. We have a certain process on how we leverage the business strategy piece as well as the human-centered design piece, which is kind of this framework at a high level here. We understand that we are agilists, right? This is actually on the left-hand side here, the steering committee meeting is paying homage to SAFe, which is Scalable Agile Framework. And a piece of that is the LACE, right? And so essentially it's constantly getting the steering committee involved. The steering committee is made up of the stakeholders or the executives that are essentially the project sponsors or the product sponsors. And we want them to have visibility. We also understand that you have a day job, right? Most importantly, right? And this is not it. However, you need some insight. What's going on here? And you need to also provide direction. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we definitely afford that. We suggest that, we ask that of our clients. We break it down to essentially 3 different phases, and you're probably wondering why in phase 2 and phase 3 they're broken into separate pieces. And I'll get to that in a second. Phase 1. Before we go anywhere, we need to align and assess. So typically, a lot of this engagement is setting that kind of business foundation, right? Do you have a business strategy? Have you, and a lot of what Chris has mentioned is, where are you in your customer segmentation? Where are you in a lot of your business foundational strategy layer efforts? If some of those things or all of those things have been defined, we could probably just breeze right through phase 1 and jump right into phase 2, because we understand at CEI that innovation is a timely thing, right? And so if you're slow to innovate, it's not really innovative anymore. And so that's why it's so imperative to be lean, fail fast, don't do work just because we need to consume it. We need to fast track everything. Which rolls me into why we actually break these up into 2 separate channels. Phase 2 is the contextual discovery phase. And what I'm suggesting, and we suggest at CEI, is that these go in sequential or the parallel efforts. One effort is getting further solidification based upon the assessment process that we've done in phase 1. We might have identified there's a certain gap analysis that we're doing there, right? And so we're filling the gaps, right? Gaps in terms of the human contextual side, right? So we need context around the human space, and in order for us to call back to this double diamond, the divergent and convergent process, is we need to understand the problem space. We need to understand what's going on, right? And then phase 1 gives us that direction. Phase 2, we fill those gaps with information, right? I'm filling mine with the HCD. My folks on my group, we're getting context based upon, like I said, the user interviews, the journeys, those types of things, just to position around the human element. And on the other side of phase 2, folks on Chris's side are solidifying that business strategy based upon the gaps they've seen in phase 1. It could be a lighter on the HCD side and heavier on the business side, or vice versa in phase 2. And in phase 3, we take those findings, and as you actually probably can see, there's a little squiggly line there. That squiggly line is a communication channel between both sides, right? And that's a continual process. It's a collaboration funnel. And so sometimes we find ourselves learning something that we need to immediately let the business side know that may pivot their direction, and vice versa. The business might find something that there's a driver here, and you guys, rather than focusing on this particular user, we just quantified that you should be focusing over here. So we are constantly pivoting, which allows us for that high velocity, right? Where we're delivering at a very rapid pace, a very lean pace to really be innovative. And then phase 3 is the ideation and documentation. It's the crystallizing phase, right? And in the design phase, in the human-centered design phase, we are crystallizing a product. Maybe if it's tactile or a process map or something that via our context, we highly suggest this action, and this action is done, and this is how we're going to do it. Essentially the second diamond. And on the flip side, on the business side, they're firming up their documentation. They're firming up all those findings on the business strategy side and then presenting that in documentation format. So at a high level, that's how we can get started. Like I said, at any phase, maybe you've done phase 1, we engage in phase 2, maybe you've done a little bit of the HCD stuff and not so much of the business. We can delve in from a business side, or we can delve into the HCD side. So whatever, as long as you have those artifacts to present to us so we can consume and sponge up that information, that's the only contingency. So feel free to reach out to Chris, myself, or Norma, and if you need any assistance, any follow-up questions. Here at CEI, we're ready and willing to answer anything that you may have for us.
Justin, thank you very much. And also thank you, Chris, and thank you, Norma, for sharing your insights and some real life examples of HCD. To everyone on the line, we also appreciate your time. We hope you found the content valuable. This does conclude our webinar for today, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.